What if one country could reshape the global economy? Not with armies first, but with roads, railways, ports, and debt. What if infrastructure became the new weapon of power? In 2013, China launched one of the most ambitious geopolitical projects in human history, the Belt and Road Initiative, or simply the BRI. A trillion-dollar network of highways, ports, pipelines, rail corridors, power plants, digital infrastructure, and strategic investment stretching across continents involving hundreds of countries. China says it is reviving the ancient Silk Route. Critics, on the other hand, say it is building a new Chinese world order. And for India, this project is not just economy. It is about strategic, military, geopolitical, and deeply personal too. Because one of China's biggest projects runs directly through territory which is India's. Let's decode China's Belt and Road Initiative. How it works, why countries are joining, why the West is worried, and why does India see it as one of the biggest strategic challenges of the century. Welcome to News First. Here we break down the puzzling world of geopolitics, military, world affairs, and other information which impacts you into easily consumable videos. We also track sports and politics. Do like this video and subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for alerts. Now back to the topic. The Belt and Road Initiative was unveiled by Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2013. The goal? To connect China with Asia, Europe, Africa and beyond through massive infrastructure investment. The belt refers to overland trade corridors. The road actually refers to maritime shipping routes. Together they form a gigantic global connectivity network. Today, BRI project spans more than 150 countries. China finances highways in Africa, railways in Southeast Asia, ports in the Indian Ocean, energy corridors in Central Asia, and digital infrastructure across other developing economies. This is not just trade, this is about influence. China's state-owned banks, companies, and engineering giants fund and build projects that many developing countries desperately need, especially countries struggling with infrastructure gaps. For many governments, Chinese money arrives faster than Western financing. Less paperwork, fewer conditions, quicker approvals. And that speed has made China indispensable in parts of the developing world. But critics argue that rapid financing comes with hidden long-term costs, because infrastructure is never just infrastructure. It creates leverage. The scale of China's investment is staggering in the BRI. In Africa alone, Chinese financing for transport, power and water projects averaged more than $15 billion annually after 2012. Across the world, Chinese lending surged dramatically during the 2010s. At its peak, annual BRI lending crossed $100 billion. The investment has spread continent by continent. In Asia, China has invested heavily in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Laos, Indonesia and Central Asia. Projects include railways, ports, pipelines and energy corridors. In Africa, China financed roads, hydropower plants, rail systems, ports, airports and urban infrastructure. Countries across East Africa became major recipients. Chinese investment expanded into logistical hubs, ports and transport corridors in Europe. Greece Piraeus port became one of the most symbolic examples of China's growing footprint in Europe. China pushed energy and transport partnership to secure trade routes and long-term energy access in the Middle East. And in Latin America, BRI partnerships expanded into mining, telecom and strategic infrastructure. But there is a crucial detail many countries discovered later. Chinese loans are often not structured like traditional World Bank scenarios. Some are concessional, some are commercial, and many are tied to global interest rates like LIBOR or Euribor, meaning repayments can suddenly become far more expensive. That is where the controversy begins. Critics argue China is practicing what is called debt trap diplomacy. The allegation is explosive that Beijing gives large loans to vulnerable countries knowing they may struggle to repay them. And when repayment becomes impossible, China gains strategic leverage. The most famous example is in India's neighborhood, Sri Lanka's Hambantota Port. Unable to service debt obligations, Sri Lanka eventually entered a debt for equity arrangement that gave China long-term control over the port. Globally, the incident triggered alarm bells. Was this a strategic trap or simply a failed infrastructure gamble? Some analysts argue the Sri Lankan government itself proposed the swap. Others say the outcome will demonstrate the dangers of unsustainable debt. Either way, the message is clear. Countries borrowing heavily from China could become financially vulnerable, and unlike multilateral institutions, many Chinese loans lack transparency. Loan terms, contractor agreements, environmental assessments, debt obligation. Much of these remains difficult to track publicly. Western governments and think tanks warn that hidden debt exposure could trigger future economic crisis. China rejects these allegations. Beijing says BRI is about development, connectivity and shared growth. And many developing countries agree because they need finances and money immediately. Because without Chinese money, many projects would never exist. No continent represents the BRI debate more dramatically than Africa. China became one of Africa's largest infrastructure financiers. Railways, roads, power plants, ports, water systems. Many African governments welcomed Chinese financing because Western funding for large infrastructure projects remained limited. World Bank projects often took years due to environmental reviews and regulatory procedures. Chinese projects moved faster, on the other hand. For governments reading urgent infrastructure, speed mattered, but concerns grow alongside investment. Critics warned about rising debt burdens, weak transparency, limited environmental safeguards, and the import of large number of Chinese workers instead of creating local jobs. Environmental groups raised alarms about ecological damages linked to mining, transport, and energy projects. At the same time, supporters argue that roads, electricity, ports, and railways are essential for economic growth. To many African nations, China offered something the world often discussed but rarely delivered: large-scale infrastructure and money, that too fast. But the BRI is not viewed purely as economics. Many countries see a strategic and military dimension, especially India. Indian analysts fear that Chinese-funded ports across the Indian Ocean could eventually support military operations. This fear is linked to the so-called strings of pearl theory by the Chinese government, a network of Chinese strategic footholds stretching from South China Sea to the Arabian Sea. Ports in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, potential access points across the Indian Ocean, right in India's backyard. Officially, these are commercial projects, but critics argue that dual-use infrastructure can quickly acquire military value. Ports built for trade today can support naval logistics tomorrow. China's expanding naval capabilities have only intensified those concerns. The digital Silk Route adds another layer. Telecommunications, data infrastructure, surveillance systems, digital connectivity. For India and several Western nations, this raises questions not just about economics but about strategic control over future networks. Because in the modern world, whoever controls infrastructure often controls influence. India is one of the few major powers that openly refuse to join the Belt and Road Initiative. The biggest concern is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, one of the flagship projects of the BRI. The corridor passes through Gilgit-Baltistan, which Pakistan has occupied illegally, in Kashmir, territory which is Indian. For New Delhi, this is not policy disagreement, it is a direct challenge to our sovereignty. India argues that connectivity projects must respect territorial integrity and international norms. But India's concerns go far beyond the borders. New Delhi fears the BRI could create a Sino-centric regional order, an Asia economically dependent on China, strategically influenced by Beijing, and increasingly surrounded by Chinese infrastructure. Indian policymakers also worry about debt dependence among neighboring countries, Chinese military access to ports, digital surveillance expansion, and the strategic isolation of India. In response, India launched counter strategies. The India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC, the International North-South Transport Corridor, or INSTC. India also strengthened partnership with the United States, Japan, and Australia through the Quad. This is not just diplomacy, it is geopolitical balancing. India's message is clear. Connectivity must be transparent, sustainable, consultative, and not controlled by one dominant power. The Belt and Road Initiative is evolving. China is shifting from massive lending towards more selective investment partnerships. The early phase focused heavily on giant infrastructure. The next phase appears more strategic: technology, energy, digital infrastructure, supply chains, critical minerals. Despite criticism, the BRI remains one of the largest geopolitical projects ever attempted. For China and its supporters, it's a lifeline for development. For critics, it is a mechanism for dependence and influence. And for India, it is a long-term strategic challenge unfolding across its neighborhood. The battle for the Belt and Road Initiative is ultimately a battle over the future global order. Who builds the roads? Who finances the ports? Who controls trade routes? Who shapes connectivity? And who leads Asia in the 21st century? China calls the Belt and Road Initiative a pathway to shared prosperity. Its critics call it strategic expansion through infrastructure. The truth may lie somewhere in between. But one thing is undeniable. The BRI has already changed global geopolitics, and the competition between China and India may define the next era of Asia. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe for more deep geopolitical and military analysis. Comment below. Is the BRI development or dependency?